Hey everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 105 online, and today we're going to be talking about culture, European culture, and whether or not culture is destiny. Now, before we do that, I want you to take a couple minutes to do a couple of things, and I want you to pause the video and do this. I want you to think of what things make up the culture that you live in. And you can either think of college culture, or you can think of your ethnic cultural background, or you can think of culture in the United States. And I want you to kind of brainstorm some things that make up what you think culture is. Then I want you to think about a time when you've experienced culture shock. Okay, and I'll define the culture shock, what I mean by this. Culture shock is the upset and stress we experience when confronted with behaviors and beliefs that differ significantly from our own. Now, I'm all sure we've probably had some instance of where we had this great culture shock. An example would be when I traveled to Europe for about 11 months and living in France. I definitely witnessed how things were different and how I would have to adjust over time. So go ahead and pause the video and kind of write down some things that you think are examples of culture shock. Okay, so hopefully you've had some time to write down some things and brainstorm a little bit about what makes up your culture and what kind of things you've dealt with when you dealt with culture shock. Now, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about how culture is destiny. The idea that what made up Europe at this time was a culture that was very difficult to break away from. Now, in this lecture, we're going to talk specifically about what we call the Great Chain of Being, which posited an ordered, hierarchical universe in which every creature, especially humans, was placed in a particular rank by God. And to rebel against that order, even to try to rise higher than one's place at birth, was thus to challenge God's own mandate. But as Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, the great chain of being was being challenged and strained by forces in politics, society, religion, and culture. And those forces will be the subject of the next kind of 6 discussions we have in this course. So again, we've got this culture that's ingrained, and we've got these new waves that are coming in, and we're going to have some examples where people might be experiencing culture shock. Now, we've talked about geography as destiny, but culture is too. How people perceive their reality is at least as important as the physical and social topography discussed in the last lecture. Now, in 1500, most European men and women were what we would call Catholics today. All European men, women, and children were taught that God created the universe, ordered it, and was active in its everyday working. Now, when asked to describe the universe or its parts, late medieval commentators fell back on metaphors. One of their favorite metaphors for society was that of the body politic. A more comprehensive metaphor, because it took into account God and all the creatures in this universe, was the one that historians later dubbed the Great Chain of Being. Now, it's important to note that I will also discuss the Great Chain in a little bit later on, and you can find stuff when you specifically talk about the world of history in Europe, for example, in Great Britain. This is really the organization, the hierarchical organization of culture. Now, Europeans generally believed in the Ptolemaic universe, basically a series of concentric spheres with the Earth right in the center. Copernicus published what's called De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, or On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, in 1543. But his ideas would only begin to gain ground around 1600. Now, in 1500, most people still believed that moving from the outer sphere inward, the universe consisted of the stars, the planets, the sun, the moon, and at the center, the earth. At the center of earth were the flames of hell, the very beginning. Now, as this implies, when they thought about the inhabitants of that universe, they thought of a hierarchy, arranged in the diagram that you see below after you leave this lecture. The celestial hierarchy consisted of God, angels, man, animals, plants, and stones. There are 5 things to remember about this system. Those at the top of the hierarchy were closer to God than those at the bottom. And humankind is halfway down the chain. So we have God at the top, stones at the bottom, humans in the beginning. Suspended between the angels and the animals. Now, apart from God, each of the ranks in the chain would be further divided. Angels were divided into 9 ranks. The animal, plant, and stone hierarchies could be similarly divided. And so with man, king, aristocrats, peasants, laborers, and the poor. And these ranks can be further subdivided. Every rank might be further divided into families with the gender ranked. So we'll have, for example, peasants, father, mother, children, or father, mother, son, daughter, for example. Or in that precise, or actually it would probably be father, son, wife, or mother, daughter. The top of each part of the chain, or in theory, every single creature and object in God's universe could be placed precisely in this hierarchy. Now, the top of each chain, part of the chain, is analogous to the head of the whole chain, God himself. Clearly, the people of Europe in 1500 were obsessed with order, and by the same token, their greatest fear was the opposite, disorder. The chain is a chain, not a ladder. Because the chain was considered to be God's plan, it was a grave sin to attack the chain, disobey one's superiors, rebel against the king, or even try to rise to another rank. Now, clearly, European society in 1500 valued order, not opportunity, conformity, not originality, and community, not individuality. The top 3 ranks of the human chain consisted of less than 10% of the population. And that 10% owned perhaps 50% of the land in Europe and possessed nearly 100% of the power. Now, we might well ask why the other 90% of the people put up with this system. Now, this system was drilled into the people of Europe from the pulpit every Sunday, and after all, it explained their universe and probably did prevent disorder that they would otherwise have been unable to stop. Now imagine what a European from 1500 would think of the universe, noise, and chaos of our world today. And imagine if you were to go back in time and witness this world. Now, another explanation for widespread acceptance of the chain can be found in 2 related beliefs designed to mitigate the worst effects of inequality: paternalism and deference. Now, paternalism was the belief also taught from every pulpit in Europe and often embodied in proclamation and law, that those at the upper end of the chain had a responsibility to look after those below them. Deference, which is allegiance, obedience, and respect, was the attitude that the lower orders were supposed to display towards those at the top of the chain. Thus, in European universe of 1500, every man, woman, and child knew where he or she stood. Or did they? The chain was an ideal of order and stability, but life is ever messy and mutable. And as this course opens, the ideal of the chain fit less and less with the realities of European life. The composition of the various ranks changed. Nobility was supposedly the oldest, most distinguished families in Europe, but some noble families were upstarts, receiving their titles through royal favor or court service. Other families died out and were deprived of their titles on conviction of treason. And as a result, the oldest families were in fact constantly renewed with new blood. Peasants rose and fell with fluctuations in the economy and fluctuations in the weather. Some people fell out of the chain entirely by forming chains of their own that did not seem to fit into the main social hierarchy. Now, aside from people, cities had their own chains, consisting of the mayor, the alderman, burghers, or members of the town council, citizens or freemen, that is, members of the guild, journeymen, apprentices, and so on, and everybody else. Now, it was difficult to figure how to fit this chain into the main one. Cities were places where capitalism flourished. People could grow rich very fast and thus rise in status, and people can grow very poor and thus fall in status. Cities were places of relative anonymity. It was harder to tell who was who and who belonged to whom in a city. Now, unlike the parish and village, everybody did not know everybody else, and it was possible to escape one's rank in the main chain by going to the city. Thus, the economic and social fluidity of cities made nonsense of the chain. Now, in the East, Russia and portions of southern Europe ruled by the Ottoman Empire, the Orthodox churches were subordinate to the civil authority. But in the West, the Roman Catholic Church had its own chain: the Pope, archbishops, bishops, priests, sisters, and the laity. Now, the church hierarchy too raised problems for the chain. If the Pope was the vicar of Christ and the emperor of the king was the God's lieutenant, who was superior? That is, while these two leaders usually agreed, what if they didn't? Now, during 1309 to 1373, the King of France more or less abducted the papacy to Avignon, called the Babylonian captivity of the church, which led many people to view the papacy as a tool of the French monarchy. Now, during the Great Schism of 1374 to 1417, there was more than one pope. Two separate sets of cardinals elected popes, and each one excommunicated the other. Now, during this time, some rulers encouraged their subjects to question papal authority. During the Middle Ages, a growing chorus had criticized both the doctrine and practice of the Church. The Church regarded such critics as heretical, enforcing discipline with the cooperation of kings, but burning heretics at the stake. There remained a small minority of Christians, though, who wanted a more democratic, less hierarchical church. Now, what would happen if the king ever agreed with them? Now, these problems were inevitable, given the tensions between the chain and the reality of European medieval life. But as Europe entered the 16th century, it was beginning to experience 6 new challenges that would eventually smash the chain and lay the groundwork for the modern world: Renaissance humanism, the rise of centrally governed nation-states, the discovery of the New World, the invention of the printing press, the Protestant Reformation and its consequence, the War of Religions, and the rational and scientific revolutions. So this is the end of today's lecture on how culture is destiny, History 105 with Professor Hasselman.